Chapter 6, Deviance and Social Control. Deviance, according to sociologists, is the term used to refer to any violation of rules and norms. Acts of deviance can be as minor as driving over the speed limit or as extreme as committing murder. We're going to go over some of these violations of norms, social norms, talk about how deviance is relative, how norms actually make social life possible, and then we'll talk some about sanctions. So from a sociological perspective, deviance is relative, which means that definitions of what is deviant vary across societies and cultures, and deviance varies from one group to another within the same society. According to sociologist Howard S. Becker, 1966, it is not the act itself, but the reactions to the act that make something deviant. So, for example, I usually describe this example of my oldest son when he was young, and I took him to a school Halloween party, and all the kids were dressed up in their costumes, and a young friend, a classmate of my son, came running up to him and tapped him real hard on the shoulder and called him by name, and then kept running past. Now, my son's reaction to that act was, "Hey, he hit me," and was about to take off after him had I not been there to observe the situation and say, no, he really was, just saying hello, and he recognized you, and he just ran by in a pretty forceful way. He wasn't hitting you, he was just tapping you. And so I had to, but otherwise my son's reaction would have been what was deviant in the fact that he was ready to take off and start a fight with this young boy, unfortunately. So that's kind of a way to kind of think about, it's not the act itself, but the reactions to the act that make something deviant. And because different groups have different norms, what is deviant for some is not deviant for others. And this is true even for crime. Criminal deviance, the violation of rules that have been written into law. This is also relative. The laws will vary according to culture. Now, deviants are people who violate rules, and it could be as serious as committing a crime, like I mentioned, murder. But it could also be as minor as jaywalking, arriving to class late, talking during a movie, or walking up the town escalator, things like that. It is a neutral term, and when we sociologists study deviance, we are non-judgmental. That means we do not judge the behavior as either good or bad. Just what it is viewed negatively by people within the social group. We do not view the behavior as either good or bad. We really want to know, what is that behavior. To sociologists, all people are deviants because everyone violates rules from time to time. Now, a stigma is something we don't have to do anything to be deviant. And Irving Goffman, 1963, he used the term stigma to refer to the characteristics or attributes that discredit or debase a person's normal identity. So, for example, being homeless or having a disability, things like, if you're homeless and you wear tattered clothing, that would be a stigma symbol. Being an ex-convict or being a former alcoholic. Now, some of these things are involuntary, so it's an involuntary membership. These stigma symbols often become a person's master status, sort of overshadowing all their other statuses. A birthmark, for example, or a limp. As opposed to what a prestige symbol is. And if you think of a prestige symbol, something that is like the military uniform, someone who's in the military, the white lab coat of a doctor or a police or fireman's badge, the judge's gown that they wear. Those are things that give that person prestige. whereas a homeless person's tattered clothing, and that would be something of a stigma. Now, norms are what make social life possible. Norms, by making our behavior predictable. Without norms, there would be social chaos. So we know that, if norms did not exist, social chaos would exist. Example would be, driving on the right side of the road, and versus, if you all of a sudden start driving on the wrong side of the road. Chaos. We need to have the rules of the road to kind of maintain social order. Um, so we know that our roles are norms, and that social order is what group social arrangements, those customary social arrangements are. And the reason deviance is seen as threatening is because it undermines that predictability. A system of social control is developed to maintain social order. And these are either formal or informal means of enforcing our norms. We know what to expect. We know that we need to, what side of the road to drive on when we learn that first. When we walk into a classroom, we know where to go and sit down. When we walk into a movie theater, we go in and we find our seats. We know what to do in a grocery store. We know what to do when we walk into a church or synagogue. We're quiet and so forth. So that is how we maintain social order. It's developed to maintain that. Social control is developed to maintain that social order. It's an enforcement of those formal or informal means. And when a norm is violated, sanctions are imposed. And sanctions can either be positive or negative. Think of this in terms of positive reinforcement versus negative reinforcement. Negative sanctions would reflect disapproval of a particular behavior, and it ranges from, someone frowning at a child who may have done something, wrong, or gossip for breaking a folkway, to imprisonment and capital punishment for breaking a mores. So the more serious the group takes the norm, the harsher the penalty for violating it. Positive sanctions would be something like smiles. Smile for something that somebody did a good job, or someone held the door open, you smile at them and you thank them. And so looks of approval. To any kind of formal reward, like getting a raise for doing a good job, or getting a medal. And these are used to reward conformity, following the norms. Now, most sanctions are informal. Shaming is an example. It's also a sanction. It's particularly effective when used by members of a primary group or in a small community. So shaming can be like a public ritual, wearing a sign that's, some offenders are often ordered to wear a sign that says, "I am a thief," for shoplifting or something of that nature. And this marks that violator as being deviant for everyone in the community to see. The degradation ceremony is defined by Harold Garfinkel, and this is a formal way of really shaming and stripping a person of their formal identity. In the Stanford prison experiment that we watched earlier on in the semester, we saw an example of a degradation ceremony where many prisoners are degraded. They're stripped down of their anything that represents their formal identity, and they put on, the uniform, and then they're assigned a number, and they're, often sometimes their hair is shaved, and so it really strips them of their individuality, and they're degraded in the form of being a prisoner at this time. Next, we're going to talk about some theories and some competing explanations of deviance. Biologists, psychologists, and sociologists have different perspectives on why people violate norms. Sociobiologists and psychologists explain deviance by looking within the individual, while sociologists look at forces outside of the individual. Now, early explanations focused on the supernatural or even genetic factors. A person may have had bad blood, which resulted in them being deviant. With the biosocial explanations, biological explanations, they focus on the genetic predispositions that lead people to such behavior. Factors like a person's intelligence, or there's the also the XY. Look, the intelligence and before I go forward is they look at IQ tests and scores and determine whether or not that would predispose someone to be deviant. Not having a high intelligence test score. The XYY theory, having an extra Y chromosome in men was a theory to explain, what leads to crime. And then also even body type, is a person muscular or they have a squarish body shape that leads to street crimes, things like mugging and rapes and burglaries. Street crimes, are acts like that. Also, we'll talk a little bit more about index crimes. Index crimes are things that are measured or tabulated. They're the 8 crimes tabulated each year by the FBI, and they classify them according to violent crimes versus property crimes. Violent crimes are crimes committed against individuals or people, and then property crimes are things that are committed against property. So we've got, the violent crimes are murder, rape, robbery, assault. And then property crimes are burglary, theft, motor vehicle theft, and even an arson. So, looking at the type, the body type to determine, is a person, predisposed to commit street crimes based on their body type. Our inherited propensities modified and stimulated by our environment, something that we also, consider in the biosocial. I had a professor at Temple University at one point, and Dr. Savitz, who explained, his crime and film course, how at one point, they would measure the brain size of criminals after their death in prison, and look at the brain size to try to, determine again something characteristic of a criminal, what would predispose them to be a criminal. Next, we have our psychological explanations. And psychological explanations focus on personality disorders, a bad childhood experience, that developed into a deviant personality. Some examples, could be bad toilet training as a child, mothers who often smother their children, fathers who were distant during the development of the child. But these explanations do not necessarily result in the presence or absence of specific forms of deviance in a person. Deviance is not associated with any particular personality. In fact, a characteristic like, being aggressive, as part of someone's personality. Well, yes, maybe some criminals are aggressive, but the common individual could be aggressive in terms of being forceful in working their way up the social class ladder. So, don't necessarily become associated with any particular personality characteristic that would lead them to a life of crime. So we, as sociologists, we look for sociological explanations to focus on factors outside of the individuals. What are the social forces that may result in some people breaking social norms? For example, crime is a violation of norms that are written into law, and each society has its own laws against certain types of behavior. Therefore, a sociologist would look at the social influences like socialization, subcultural groups or social classes that might result in someone violating the law in that society. So now we'll take a look at the 3 sociological perspectives to explain deviance. We'll look at symbolic interactionism, functionalism, and conflict theory. Now, within the sociological, within the symbolic interactionist perspective, there are 3 theories we'll cover: differential association. We're going to look at control theory and labeling theory. The basic premise in the symbolic interactionist perspective is that we are thinking beings who act according to how we interpret situations. Therefore, our membership in different groups influences how we view life and therefore how we behave. So with the differential association theory, this theory, according to Edwin Sutherland, differential association is the term used to describe that those who associate with groups oriented toward deviant activities learn an excess of definitions of deviance and are more likely to engage in deviant acts. So the key to a differential association is the learning of ideas and attitudes that are favorable to following the law or breaking it. We learn either to conform or to deviate. The frequency and duration is important. So it doesn't account for any kind of first-time offenders. So you'd have to be frequently exposed, and it would have to be a long duration that you're exposed to this type of behavior. So for example, some groups teach members to violate norms. Being in families, for example, those involved, families involved in crime or in prison, being that primary group, this may influence their children into a life of crime. The friends, the neighbors, the subcultures, hanging out with the wrong crowd, living in a bad neighborhood, or belonging to a street gang. These will often encourage that deviant behavior. So the question becomes, prison or freedom? Our choices will point us into different directions. Interactionists stress that we make or produce our own orientations to life, and we don't always follow the group. Or we choose a group that will point us in the right path. The choice of association, helps to shape the self. So if you join a group or organization that studies and does well in school and looks towards their future goals, you'll also behave and engage in those activities versus, joining a street gang that's involved and motivated by, street gangs and criminal activity. So it's those choices that we make that help shape the self. Control theory is part of the symbolic interactionist perspective. According to this theory, we're all tempted to break society's norms, but it is a system of controls that prevent us from acting on these impulses. The theory is Walter Reckless is the theorist, 1973, who developed control theory and described two systems of control, inner and outer control. Our inner controls involve our conscience or our internalized morality, the fear of punishment and the desire to be good. The outer controls involve groups, the people who influence us not to deviate, our family, our friends, the police. These are the outer controls that encourage us to do the right thing. According to sociologist Travis Hershey, the stronger our bonds are to society, the more effective our inner controls. So our connections to our family, our friends, and in the community. And these bonds or connections are based on some things. So the first is based on attachments, affection and respect for people who conform to those norms. Our family, our attachment to our family. How attached are we to our families? Our commitments, having a place in society, in your family or as a student, in a job, your commitments to do well in school, your commitment to a job encourages you to do the right thing. Your involvements, being a part of approved activities, those involvements again continue to encourage you. Maybe you're part of a basketball team, and so being involved in those sorts of sporting activities or physical activities are encouraging, and those bonds of connections. And the last one is beliefs, knowing that certain actions are wrong. We learn at a very early age, what is right and what is wrong. And so having those beliefs to avoid those actions that are wrong and to do the right thing. So Hershey noted that this is more about self-control that we learned in childhood from our parents. If we're deviant, we might be punished. We face sanctions. or consequences. So we want to try to, as children, we try to avoid those things. Labeling theory is the view that labels people are given affect their own and others' perceptions of them. So behavior is then, channeled into either deviance or conformity. So, for example, a child, may be labeled by a teacher as a troublemaker in school, and if they have, maybe they have a diagnosis of ADHD, and but that teacher may have labeled them as a troublemaker, and so they may start to live up to that label. Well, if I'm gonna, get in trouble, I might as well do something that, will get me out of this class and sent to the principal's office. So, they tend to, and that label can often try to, follow that child throughout their school years. Rejecting labels. How do people neutralize the deviance? And we talk about neutralization. Gresham, Sykes, and David Matza use the term techniques of neutralization in their study of boys who use strategies to resist these labels, these societal labels. And these strategies were things like the denial of responsibility. I didn't do it. The denial of injury. You didn't really do anything wrong because no one got hurt. The denial of a victim. Well, they deserved what they got, so there was no victim really there. The condemnation of the condemners. Others had no right to judge them. Who were they to talk? And then lastly is this appeal to a higher loyalty. I had to help them. They were my friends. So they will do what they do out of loyalty to their friends. So these are sort of strategies that are used to reject the labels and appear as conforming members of society, sort of that saving face we talk about, face work. Now, most people really resist being labeled as deviant, but some actually enjoy that deviant behavior. And, like members of a subculture who choose to conform by either dressing or putting makeup or jewelry on, that kind of results in them acting a certain way. Teenagers, often kind of are good examples of this, where they're learning to really embrace their own identity, rejecting adult norms and looking to be, to develop their own individuality. There's some classic studies. William J. Chambliss, classic study of the saints versus the roughnecks. And he did this study. He looked at troubled boys from respectable homes, the saints. They were from middle-class families, and he compared them to who he labeled the roughnecks, or boys from working-class families who hang out on the street. This is an excellent example of labeling theory because of the different backgrounds. Each group was treated differently, based on their social class. And the boys ultimately lived up to those labels. The saints were just, sowing their wild oats, so to speak. The roughnecks were the troublemakers. And so police, teachers really treated them differently based on those labels. Following these young boys into as they approached adulthood, the saints were headed for success, whereas the roughnecks were headed for failure. So social class, in this case, influenced the differing perceptions, and so it ultimately affected how they were treated in society and then how they internalized that treatment. So how labels work is really complicated. The term deviant typically has a negative judgment. So it can limit a person's opportunity. It could push them toward, similarly labeled people. So instead of toward conforming individuals or groups. So a symbolic interactionist really looks at how people's definition of the situation causes them to deviate or conform to social norms. Like in the example of my son at the Halloween party, he defined the situation as that, young classmate doing something very aggressive towards him. That was his definition of the situation, and he was reacting to that. So a symbolic interactionist would look at that. How did that interaction take place? So the focus is on group membership, that differential association, and how to balance the pressure to conform or to deviate. Control theory kind of gives us that. And then the significance of people's reputations, which is labeling theory. Next, we have the functionalist perspective. And when we think of deviance, we think of dysfunction in society. However, according to functionalists, there are functions to deviance. So they really look at how deviance is functional for society. Emil Durkheim said that deviance, including crime, is functional because it contributes to social order. Deviance contributes to social order, he says, in 3 ways. First of all, deviance clarifies moral boundaries. That a group's ideas about how people should act and think. And deviance affirms norms. So it helps us define the limits of what proper behavior is. Punishing someone for being deviant affirms the group's norms, and it clarifies what it means to be a member of the group. Deviance also, he says, promotes social unity. By reacting to deviance, group members develop a we feeling, like we belong, or we feeling this collectivity, to affirm the rightness of their own ways. We have this social unity that we belong in this group, and what we do is the right way of doing things. And deviance also promotes social change. So if the boundary violations gain enough support, they become new, acceptable behaviors. So this is basically how we view things from a functionalist view, that promotes social change, in that the civil rights movement, there were injustices in society, and so going beyond and breaking down those boundaries could help change things in terms of civil rights, in terms of the women's rights, and even gay rights. I added this boundary maintenance function. Kai Erikson was is a sociologist who studied the wayward Puritans. He studied the Puritans of the 17th century New England and how women are treated. And this became known as the Salem witch trials. The Puritans continuously defined and redefined the social norms. Behavior that once was acceptable suddenly was punished for being deviant. And usually it was the religious officials who set those boundaries. So we call that the boundary maintenance function, defining what those norms are. Maybe, waking up and the next day and saying, well, maybe we should do things this way. And so, people are left unknowing, especially during the time of the Salem witch trials, what was acceptable versus unacceptable behavior. Next, we have strain theory. So according to strain theory, even mainstream values can produce crime. So according to functionalists, especially also, this is also known as Merton's theory of deviance. Robert Merton developed this theory, the strain theory, to analyze what happens when people are socialized to desire cultural goals, something we value in society. And something that we value is success. And how do we measure success? It is usually by obtaining wealth. But for many, many are denied the institutionalized means to reach that goal. So becoming successful, obtaining wealth, gaining prestige. So the institutionalized means are the legitimate ways to achieve that success. Working really hard, getting a good education, and getting a good job. So what Merton used was Emil Durkheim's term anomie. So we often hear this referred to too as the anomie theory of deviance as well. In using this term anomie to really refer to the strain that people experience when they're blocked in their attempts to achieve their goals. They experience a sense of normlessness, frustration, strain. So Mertens, he developed these 5 basic forms of adaptation, and the two most, I'm sorry, he developed 5 basic forms of adaptation. The most common reaction to cultural goals and institutionalized means is conformity. We would conform. We use the lawful means to seek our goals in society, those goals that society sets. So the conformist is seeking a societal goal, which is to obtain success, to gain wealth. And they do this through legitimate means, by working hard, getting an education, and getting a good job. That's the conformist. That's conforming. Now, the other ways, the 4 types, the 4 other ways are the deviant responses, or what he calls adaptations. So, for example, the innovator. The innovator accepts the societal goal, but uses illegitimate means to achieve the goal. So, the innovator might, embezzle. They might, sell drugs. They might steal, shoplift, in order to achieve that goal, because they still want that goal of success, and success is measured through a person's wealth. The ritualist rejects the societal goal, and they've often given up. This is a teacher who may experience burnout. They're just burned out from their jobs, but they still work toward the goal. They still need their job, so they're still going to work toward that goal. Other examples of a ritualist would be a bureaucrat. Still going through the ritual of their jobs. Steve Jobs, the inventor of the Apple iPod, the iPhone that we have in our pockets. He was a ritualist. He was a bureaucrat. He was a ritualist. I'm sorry. He followed the rules. He was an inventor, and so he did obtain wealth, but he wasn't really concerned with the wealth. He was more concerned with inventing. So he really, he didn't have the larger goal in mind. Next, we have the retreatist. Now, the retreatist rejects the societal goal of obtaining wealth and rejects the means to obtain the goal. So these are, these are retreatists. These are people who are alcoholics, drug addicts who are really withdrawing from society. Women who enter the convent, men who enter the monastery, retreating from, societal, not really, caring about success or wealth, and really not caring about the means to obtain that sort of thing. Another example would be if you watched, the Jeannie Wiley documentary, who was sort of locked, the Jeannie the Wild Child, who was locked away in her bedroom by her family. Her family, they were really withdrawing and from society. They were really, the bushes were growing up around their house. They really were they weren't seen very much in public, and obviously she was locked in her room. So that's another example of a retreatist, someone who's withdrawing from society, not interacting, not being integrated into the community. Last is the rebel. Rebels reject both the goal and the means in which to obtain the goal, and then they attempt to replace with a new goal and with a new means for reaching them. These are your revolutionaries. These are political activists. These are, the Occupy Wall Street movement had this in mind. These were the rebels. So according to this theory, to strain theory, deviants are the product of society. The people who feel the strain and frustration are more likely to take deviant paths. And there's this expression, desperate times call for desperate measures. And so, we see that this would be more influential in those circumstances. And this table illustrates Merton's theory of deviance, how people match their goals to their means, whether you're conformists or you follow more deviant paths. So this is a nice, summary of what I just described in the previous slide. Okay, so we want to consider the illegitimate opportunity structures, or and look at social class and crime. Sociologists Richard Cloward and Lloyd Olin developed illegitimate opportunity theory to explain why social classes have distinct styles of crime. So first of all, we have street crime, and they suggest the differences are due to differential access to the institutionalized means. In other words, members of the poor or lower classes may face barriers to the means or the route to success, namely, a good education. So facing barriers to obtain the means of reaching the goal of success, these individuals may seek alternative opportunities. Illegitimate opportunity structures are opportunities for crimes, such as robbery, burglary, drug dealing, that become part of the way of life. And these structures may result when legitimate structures fail them. So for the urban poor, there are opportunities to make money through hustles or, such as a robbery or burglary or drug dealing, prostitution, pimping, gambling, and other crimes. The hustler is a role model because he or she is one of the few who comes close to the cultural goals of success. So organized crime and gangs, wearing flashy jewelry and driving around in expensive cars, with a lot of money in their pockets. So they appear to be prestigious, but in fact it's been obtained in an illegitimate way. The other thing we want to talk about are white collar crimes, and here we have again Edwin Sutherland is the name most associated with the study of white collar crime. Crimes that people of respectable and high social status commit in the course of their occupations. This results from an illegitimate opportunity structure among higher classes. So for example, physicians who cheat Medicare, investment managers like Bernie Madoff and the Ponzi scheme. These are examples of, people in, upper class occupations who cheat and rob other people. Tax evasion is an example, embezzling, bribing public officials, insider, trading in the stock market. Martha Stewart is an example there if you wanted to look those names up. So those are examples of, the white collar crimes. Corporate crime is a type of white collar crime where executives break the law in order to benefit the corporation. Usually the intention is to increase profits. So fraud, deceptive investing practices, a process known as sweeping, where people who work for in a credit card company, they sweep money. They impose fees on people's credit cards, and sometimes they go unnoticed. Unsafe work practices, violating safety laws, creating pollution in the environmental safety, dumping waste in the environment. So these are all unsafe work practices that corporate crimes have occurred. Tech-based crimes, identity theft, all fall under this category. So such crimes exist in great numbers, more than most people realize. It can be very costly, several $100 million a year. And it can involve physical harm and sometimes even death. When products are put out on the market, the recalls we hear periodically are when a product, unsafe product is put out on the market, pushed along, for the intention of getting profits back for the company. So unsafe working conditions, can kill about 100,000 Americans a year, about 5 times the number of people killed by street crime. Now, it is the street crime, however, that we fear the most, but it is probably the white collar crime that we're most exposed to be victims of. Yet we do fear the street crime, the stranger danger, that sort of thing, probably the most. This table illustrates the women, and if we look at gender and crime, we're witnessing some changes recently in the nature of crime, and a major change is the increasing numbers of female offenders. As women have become more involved in the professions and in the corporate world, they have been exposed to these illegitimate opportunities. Criminologists Frida Adler and Meta Chesney-Lind explain that as women assume more active, powerful roles, gender differences and deviance in crime are narrowing. In fact, between 1999 and 2008, the Department of Justice found female arrests for major crimes increased by 12%, while comparable male arrests declined by 19%. So we see by looking the percent change in all of these different crimes have all increased and increased by a large percentage. So in sum, just as the social class differ in opportunities for income and education, so do they for crime. Street crime is greater among the lower classes. White-collar crime is higher among the upper classes. So the greater opportunities for women as well means more access to commit crimes. The only decline has been in fraud. This is based on the Statistical Abstract of the United States. So the percent change between 1992 and 2014. Now we'll take a look at the conflict perspective. Conflict theorists argue that power plays a central role in defining and punishing deviance. So the legal system here is very inconsistent with its treatment of influential people versus poor people who break the law. The state's machinery of social control represents the interests of the wealthy and powerful. This group determines the laws whose enforcement is essential for maintaining its power. So how can our legal system be so inconsistent? The criminal justice system, the police, the courts, prisons that deal with people who are accused of having committed crimes, directs its energies against violations of the working class, while it tends to overlook the harm done by the owners of corporations. The criminal justice system is noted as an instrument of oppression. For the poor, the law is an instrument of oppression. The law as a tool designed to maintain the powerful in privileged positions, and it keeps the powerless from rebelling and overthrowing the social order. When members of the working class get out of line, they are arrested, they're tried and imprisoned in the criminal justice system. And because street crimes threaten the social order that keeps the elite in power, they are punished severely. So most of the prison inmates in the U.S. are from the poor and underclass. They are the least rooted in society. They're in low-pay, part-time, seasonal jobs, if they work at all. But executives of corporations, the capitalist class, they get away with manufacturing unsafe products. They create pollution. They manipulate prices, yet they only are occasionally prosecuted. When there are extreme violations, they may be prosecuted, and this gives an impression of fairness of the system. So this map illustrates how safe the various states are, and they look at violent crimes in the United States. Violent crimes, again, are those crimes that are committed against people: murder, rape, robbery, and aggravated assault. So your author took data from the Statistical Abstract of the United States and found the safest states are Vermont, Maine, and then New Hampshire, Virginia, and Wyoming are a tie. The most dangerous states, Nevada and Alaska. Nevada has moved up into the top slot with Alaska. Alaska is an interesting state, being most dangerous. If you look at the lack of police forces. So if a crime does occur, it's very difficult for there's large spans of land where it's not covered by police. So the chance of becoming a victim of a violent crime is 5 times higher in a state like Tennessee. The safest state being Washington D.C., which is not a state at all. It is in a class all by itself. So it's interesting to look at the purple states being, safer than the average, orange states being, average safety, and then the green states being more dangerous than the average. And I think New Jersey is safer than the average, which is in a purple. All right, so next thing we're going to look at are reactions to deviance. In the U.S., reactions range anywhere from mild sanctions, to capital punishment, which is the death penalty. Now, street crime and prisons, imprisonment is what occurs after the degradation ceremony, usually a public trial or a pronouncement that the person is unfit to live among law-abiding citizens. Now, this is an increasingly popular reaction to crime. Get the person off the streets. The possibility is that it will reduce crime. But findings show it really fails to teach inmates to stay away from crime, and it has not proven to be a deterrent to crime. The U.S. has the distinction of having not only more prisoners than any other nation, but also a larger percent of its population in prison. African Americans are disproportionately represented among the prison population. For example, 1 out of 9 African American men aged 20 to 34, compared to 1 out of 20 Latinos and 1 out of 100 whites. Close to half of all prisoners are less than 35 years old. 93% are males. And being married and having an education means you are less likely to end up in prison. So for the last 20 years, the U.S. has taken a tough stance on policy. The Three Strikes Law was a response to the rising crime rate of the 1980s. In an effort to stop repeat offenders, anyone convicted of a third felony would get an automatic sentence. The logic behind, behind this is that, being that a repeat offender or habitual offender, can't hurt a person or property if they are in prison. There are currently 28 states who have these laws, and they vary from state to state. They look at the length of time between the felonies, the seriousness of the felony, the order of the crimes committed, and the discretion of the trial judge in sentencing under the law. These laws have had some unintended consequences. For example, the punishments often are extremely disproportionate to the crime. So say, for example, a person steals videotapes. If they still sell videotapes. Under this law, they could go to jail for 25 years. That same person would only get a couple of months without the Three Strikes laws in place. Another problem is that judges may act discriminatorily against persons based on their race and give them a longer sentence. Now, some states are relaxing the penalties and reforming this law, and California happens to be one of those states. So here we see 2009, this was the peak of incarceration with 1,616,000 prisoners. So how much is that? This is the explosion in the number of U.S. prisoners. So the line graph really shows the number of prisoners in the U.S. We're starting to see, since 2010, a decline, and hopefully it's projected to be further decline. Comparing prison inmates with the U.S. population, this table illustrates, the age group. The next column is the percent of prisoners with that particular characteristic. These are prisoners of that particular age group. And then we have the percent of the U.S. population. So this is where those the data, the demographics I described earlier, this came from this table. And this is just a continuation, comparing them race and ethnicity, gender and marital status, education. The higher education, the less likely to commit crime. Okay, so in discussing there's been a decline in violent crimes, with judges putting more people in prison, and with the Three Strikes law in place, we've witnessed a sharp decline in the crime rate. But this tough stance on criminals is only one explanation. We also had higher employment, less illegal drug use, lower birth rates. Research is still being done to determine, the effectiveness of the neighborhood crime watches, McGruff the crime dog, and better policing in neighborhoods, better surveillance, cameras and security cameras are, you know, watching, different parts of our communities. The public regards crime, though, as a major social problem. We see it reported in the news, almost daily. Yet the crime rate being reported in 2012 was comparable to what it was in 1963. So, changes in public policy, changes in, public health, technology, and demographics may help to explain, why, we see and we fear that there is, a serious crime problem when, in fact, the rates have really not changed much, or they've actually declined. I pulled this table from, another text. This is the source of this is from McGraw-Hill's education textbook, and it really does show the percent change in rates of these violent crimes and property crimes, the index crimes. The first column is the actual number reported, but in order to make any kind of comparisons, we want to look at the rate per 100,000, and we see that percent change. And pretty much every index crime, there's been a decline in the crime rates. So if the goal of prisons is to rehabilitate, how well is the prison system really working? So the recidivism rate, or the proportion of people who are rearrested in the U.S. Is pretty high. So for example, 2 out of 3, it's like 68%, persons who were sent to jail for a violent offense were rearrested after only 3 years. And half of them were back in prison. So according to statistics from the Source Book of Criminal Justice Statistics, we see that the recidivism rate is relatively high. So here we see how many months after release were their arrests and where the person was back in prison. So how fast are they returning? What is that recidivism rate of U.S. prisoners? So these are the percentage of those going back to prison within 5 years of their release. So what types of crime are they being sent back to prison for? And here we have the rearrest rates of those who had been convicted of car theft, which is the highest, 78%, burglary, illegal weapons, fraud, illegal drugs, robbery, and rape. All of those are over 50% of those particular crimes. So as we've already talked about, the definition of deviant behavior varies across societies, groups, and time periods. Now, hate crime legislation in the U.S. is an example of this. In 1990, Congress passed the Hate Crimes Statistics Act. The government considers an ordinary crime a hate crime when the offender is motivated by one or more of the following characteristics: whether race, their religion, their ethnic group, their national origin or sexual orientation, even disability. So hate crimes are defined by the purpose of their conduct and not by those committing the crime. It's what motivated them. They're also known as bias crimes. In 2013, officials reported more than 7,200 hate crimes and bias-motivated incidents. This was down slightly from 2011, when it was 7,600. Now this pie chart I pulled again from another textbook that I used, McGraw-Hill, but it illustrates again the pie chart of how we categorize reported hate crimes. Again, it's these crimes are defined by the purpose of the conduct, not by those committing the crime. So it's what motivated the perpetrator. And for close to 50%, race is the motivation. Next, we have sexual orientation and religion, then ethnicity and national origin, and then lastly, disability. The death penalty and bias. The most extreme sanction that we have is the death penalty, also known as the capital punishment. Not only is it the most extreme measure that the state takes, but it is also very controversial. Many people are divided on this issue. Those who argue against it have strong DNA evidence supporting the fact that some innocent people have been sent to death row, and some even have been executed. Yet others are still passionate about their support of it. Many argue that there are biases in the use of the death penalty, and these are based on geography, social class, gender, and race and ethnicity. So first of all, geography. The death penalty is not administered evenly. Depending on the state you live in, where people commit murder will greatly determine whether or not they get the death penalty. You look at this map, these are where executions in the United States have taken place. The highest number of executions have been in Texas, Oklahoma, and Virginia. These numbers are slightly higher than the previous edition of the text. So generally, these are states where we see the death penalty in place. Some states with the death penalty that have not executed anyone, that would be the green states. And then we have states with the death penalty. Without the death penalty, which is the purple states. The states with the death penalty are the orange states. We also have social class bias. It is rare for a rich person to be sentenced to death, and by using education as a proxy, we learn that half of the prisoners on death row have not finished high school. So, because stats on social class is not really collected, we use education as a proxy. And we also need to look at gender. Gender bias is so strong that it is almost unheard of for a woman to be sentenced to death, let alone be executed. Yet women make up, a percent of death row inmates, and they commit about 10% of the murders. But on death row, men are more likely to be executed than women. And here we see close to 100%, 99.1% versus 0.9% of women. Race and ethnicity, we look at racial ethnic bias was so bad at one point, it actually put a stop to the death penalty. Donald Partington in 1965 looked at statistics in Virginia between 1908 and 1963 and found that men convicted for rape and attempted rape, he looked at, 56% were white, 44% black. 54 were executed, all were black. Not one of the whites was executed. So in 1972, the Supreme Court ruled the death penalty as applied was unconstitutional. Therefore, new laws were written by the states, and by 1977, we saw a change, Coker versus Georgia. So since being reinstated, 65% whites and 35 blacks were put to death. So we've seen, if you look at this table here, table 6.4, the race and ethnicity of 3,170 prisoners on death row, is pretty much an equal percentage of whites, African Americans, lower percent of Latinos, and Asian Americans and Native Americans have 1% each. And then you can see that percent as compared to the U.S. population. So it's relatively high of African Americans to the U.S. population being high, 42%. But if you see, it's this ruling by the Supreme Court has actually changed the laws of death row. Now, let's talk about the trouble with statistics. We need to exercise caution when we interpret crime statistics. For one, many crimes often go unreported by the victim. The social class of the offender often influences the reaction by authorities. We saw that when we talked about street crime and white-collar crime. Criminal profiles, stereotypes of the lawbreaker are often used. The more likely that person is arrested if they fit a stereotype. We call this racial profiling. Crime statistics are human creation. If police enforce laws strictly, crime stats tend to go up. If not, they tend to go down. So, you have this concept of police discretion. Police, deciding whether to arrest someone, whether to pull someone over for speeding or ignore the situation is a routine part of police work. And so crime statistics usually reflect this and many other biases in the recording of data. The view of deviance as a symptom of some underlying illness that needs to be treated by physicians is known as the medicalization of deviance. When we medicalize something, it becomes a medical matter. In this view, then, rape, murder, stealing, cheating should be treated by mental health experts and physicians. Thomas Szasz argues that mental illness is simply problem behaviors. And some of these problem behaviors have physical causes. Depression, results from a chemical imbalance in the brain. And some are learned, coping responses to having troubles and stress in our lives. So Szasz argues that social experiences and not some illness of the mind underlie bizarre behavior. Now, being mentally ill can sometimes lead to other problems like homelessness. Patients are often turned out onto the streets. Like in a movie by Michael Morris, Sicko, we see, people with mental illness who have been hospitalized are just turned out on the streets because of the lack of, beds in a hospital. But homelessness can in turn lead to unusual and unacceptable behavior and ways of thinking that are viewed as mental illness. So we can view the homeless issue in that way. Now, the need for a more humane approach is something that, Durkheim discusses how deviance is inevitable. And so a measure of society is how it treats its deviance. So the larger issues are really how to protect people from deviant behaviors that are harmful to their welfare, to tolerate those that are not harmful, and then to develop a system of fair treatment for deviance. So, many deviant acts are the reactions to many of the social inequalities that exist in society. And so that's, where we're going to be talking about next, is the inequalities that exist in society based on social class, based on race and ethnicity, and based on gender.